Somewhere over the Arabian Peninsula, a missile roughly the size of a motorcycle is cruising toward a military installation. It's an Iranian Shahed drone, cobbled together from commercial components you could probably order online. Total production cost, maybe $30,000. Now picture what rises to meet it. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor screaming upward from its battery at 3 times the speed of sound. Cost of that single defensive shot, $3.7 million. That's 125 times the value of the thing it's chasing. Hold that image in your mind. Not the explosion, not the triumphant press conference. Sit with the math, because that single transaction, repeated dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of times across the skies of the Middle East, is the mechanism by which the most powerful military in human history is quietly dismantling its own ability to fight the war that actually matters. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Interceptor, America's top-shelf missile killer, the thing that sits at the very peak of the air defense pyramid, each round costs $15 million, one shot $15 million, and when that $15 million interceptor launches to stop a $150,000 Iranian Zulfikar ballistic missile, the cost-exchange ratio hits 85 to 1 in the attacker's favor, every single time. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. While American generals stand at podiums reporting successful intercepts, while politicians congratulate themselves on ironclad defense systems, the real winner of this war is sitting quietly on the other side of the planet, not firing a single shot, not deploying a single warship, just building, producing, and waiting. And by the time anyone in a position of power figures out what actually happened here, the math will have already done its work. But that wasn't even the worst number on the spreadsheet. Let's go back to June 2025, the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. You probably remember the headlines. Interception rates above 90%, spectacular success, defense systems performing flawlessly. What you probably didn't hear was what those 12 days cost the United States in irreplaceable hardware. During that conflict, American forces reportedly fired somewhere between 100 and 150 THAAD interceptors. That number might not mean much to you until you understand the context. The entire U.S. stockpile of THAAD interceptors, every single one ever funded across all prior military budgets, was around 534 missiles as of December 2025. So in 12 days, America burned through roughly a quarter to 30% of its entire THAAD inventory, 25% gone, in less than 2 weeks. And here's the detail that keeps senior Pentagon officials staring at their ceilings at 3 in the morning. In 2025, the United States produced 96 THAAD interceptors, total, for the entire year. 96. That means those 12 days of combat consumed more interceptors than an entire year and a half of production could replace. The factory lines don't work like a light switch. These systems require exotic materials, precision-machined guidance components, and solid fuel propulsion systems that take years, not months, to rebuild. The cost-exchange ratio across the entire engagement, in the kindest possible interpretation, favored the attacker by roughly 48 to 1. In the harshest reading, when you factor in THAAD rounds fired at cheap ballistic missiles, it was closer to 85 to 1. Iran's offensive arsenal leaned heavily on Zulfikar short-range missiles at around $150,000 each. Its medium-range Imad missiles came in at maybe $250,000. Even the most advanced Iranian platforms cost a fraction of the interceptors being used to stop them. So when the generals reported that 90% of targets were intercepted, they were telling the truth. What they weren't telling you was that the magazine was getting dangerously thin, that the next Iranian salvo would cost Tehran roughly the same as the last one, and that the next American response would require production capacity that didn't exist yet. The attacker could reload faster than the defender could manufacture. And then, 8 months later, it got dramatically worse. February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, the largest coordinated military strike in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The operation hit over 1,250 targets inside Iran. It killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. It brought the full weight of American precision firepower to bear on Iranian air defenses, missile launchers, command centers, and military infrastructure across the country. And it devoured American weapons stockpiles at a rate that made the 12-day war look modest. In the first 72 hours alone, U.S. naval forces launched an estimated 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles. 400. That single 3-day burst represented roughly 10% of the entire U.S. Navy's ready-to-fire Tomahawk inventory. Now consider this. In fiscal year 2025, the United States produced 72 Tomahawks, total, for the whole year. The budget request for fiscal year 2026 asked for just 57 more. At those rates, replacing what was fired in 3 days of combat would take over 5 years of production. 5 years to rebuild what was spent in a long weekend. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated the first 100 hours of Epic Fury cost approximately $3.7 billion. Analysts from Anadolu News Agency put the combined operational spending and asset losses at roughly $10 billion over the first 10 days, or about $1 billion per day. And that figure doesn't even account for the long-term replacement costs of precision munitions that take 2 years each to manufacture from start to delivery. One person familiar with U.S. military operations told the Financial Times that the Navy would likely feel the Tomahawk expenditure for several years. That's not speculation from a think tank. That's someone inside the system, watching the numbers in real time, telling a reporter on background that the damage to American readiness is going to echo for half a decade. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop. Raytheon has announced plans to eventually boost Tomahawk production to over 1,000 per year. Lockheed signed a deal in January 2026 to quadruple THAAD production from 96 to 400 interceptors annually. These sound like impressive numbers until you realize that the THAAD ramp-up is planned to take 7 years. 7. And the Tomahawk expansion requires new supply chains, new factory capacity, new workforce pipelines that don't exist yet. The defense industrial base doesn't run on willpower and press releases. It runs on trained workers, exotic materials, and time, none of which can be wished into existence while missiles are flying. So the factories are years away from producing what the battlefield is consuming in days. And while all of this was happening, while America was pouring its most irreplaceable precision weapons into the skies over Iran, something else was underway on the other side of the planet, something that didn't require a single missile to be fired. Here's a number I want you to hold in your mind for the rest of this video. 232. That is the factor by which China's shipbuilding capacity currently exceeds that of the United States. Not 20% more, not twice as large, 232 times larger. That figure comes directly from a declassified Office of Naval Intelligence briefing slide that was verified and reported by multiple defense outlets. Chinese shipyards have a manufacturing capacity of roughly 23 million tons. American shipyards have less than 100,000. Let that sink in. The United States, the country that built the arsenal of democracy, the nation that produced more ships during World War II than the rest of the world combined, now controls 0.1% of global commercial shipbuilding. Not a typo, not a rounding error, 0.1%. China holds over 53%. And if that number still feels abstract, here's one that might make it concrete. The China State Shipbuilding Corporation, a single state-owned enterprise, built more commercial vessels by tonnage in 2024 than the entire U.S. shipbuilding industry has produced since the end of World War II. One Chinese company, 1 year versus 80 years of American output, and it wasn't even close. Now here's why this matters beyond the obvious. China operates under what's called a military-civil fusion strategy. Every commercial ship built in those yards, every tanker, every container vessel, every bulk carrier is building the organizational capacity, the supply chains, the engineering expertise, and the workforce training pipelines that feed directly into Chinese naval expansion. The world is essentially paying Beijing to build the fleet that will challenge American naval dominance. Every country that orders a container ship from a Chinese yard is subsidizing the construction of the warships that may one day face off against the U.S. Navy in the Western Pacific. The numbers on the military side are equally stark. The People's Liberation Army Navy now operates over 370 warships, making it the largest navy on the planet by ship count. The U.S. Navy, by comparison, had 296 battle force ships as of late 2024, and its own projections show that number barely growing, if not shrinking, through 2030. China's fleet is projected to reach 435 ships by the same year. The Center for Strategic and International Studies put it bluntly: the United States probably faces insurmountable obstacles to meaningful increases in shipbuilding in the coming decade. Insurmountable. That word doesn't show up often in Washington policy papers. When it does, it means something. On the warship front, the comparison is equally jarring. China has been mass-producing the Type 052D guided missile destroyer, a highly capable 7,500-ton platform, at rates that consistently exceed 3 ships per year. The American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the backbone of U.S. naval power for 3 decades, is being built at roughly 1.6 ships per year. China is outbuilding America in its primary combatant vessel class at nearly a 2-to-1 ratio, and that gap is accelerating, not closing. Then there's the Type 055. A 12,000-ton superdestroyer carrying 112 vertical launch cells, designed for cooperative engagement and over-the-horizon strike capability. China has already deployed 10 of them. The American equivalent, the Zumwalt-class destroyer, was supposed to be the Navy's next-generation surface combatant. It was capped at a production run of 3 ships after catastrophic cost overruns and technical failures. 3 against 10. And counting. The U.S. still holds certain advantages. American submarines remain superior in quieting technology and operational experience. The U.S. Navy possesses roughly 9,900 vertical launch system cells across its surface and submarine fleet, compared to about 4,200 for China, but those leads are narrowing. And if you can't produce the missiles to fill those cells because you've fired them all over the Middle East, the number of cells becomes a moot point. But the ships were almost a secondary concern compared to what was being quietly deployed on the Chinese mainland. In September 2025, during China's Victory Day parade marking 80 years since the defeat of Japan, Beijing rolled out a new weapon that sent shockwaves through every Pacific command room on the planet. The DF-26D, an upgraded variant of the missile the Pentagon already calls the Guam Killer. The original DF-26, which entered service in 2016, was already a nightmare for American military planners. An intermediate-range ballistic missile with a range exceeding 5,000 kilometers, capable of carrying conventional or nuclear warheads, specifically engineered to strike moving aircraft carriers at sea. It travels at speeds up to Mach 18 during its terminal phase. It uses mobile road launchers that can relocate and fire without relying on fixed sites. And Western analysts estimate China has somewhere between 250 and 400 launchers already deployed. The new DF-26D variant takes all of that and adds what defense experts believe is a hypersonic glide vehicle, active radar seekers, multispectral sensors, and advanced electronic countermeasures designed specifically to defeat Aegis ballistic missile defense and THAAD. In other words, it was built to beat the exact systems that America is currently emptying over the Middle East. And the DF-26 is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. China also fields the DF-21D, the original carrier killer with a shorter range, the DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle, the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missile, now operational on both destroyers and bombers. And in late 2025, the Pentagon confirmed that China is developing the DF-27, an intercontinental range anti-ship ballistic missile capable of reaching targets as far as the U.S. West Coast. These are the systems specifically designed to deny American carriers the ability to operate within effective strike range of the Chinese coast. They are the mechanism by which Beijing intends to make American power projection into the Western Pacific prohibitively expensive. Now overlay that onto what's happening in the Middle East. Every SM-3 interceptor fired at an Iranian ballistic missile over Israel is an SM-3 that isn't in a Pacific Fleet magazine. Every THAAD round expended over the Arabian Peninsula is a THAAD round not available to protect Guam. Every Patriot battery deployed to Qatar or Jordan is a battery not positioned in the first island chain. America is drawing down the exact defensive inventory it would need to survive a Chinese missile saturation attack, and it's doing it thousands of miles from the theater where those weapons actually matter most. And China doesn't even need to fire a single shot to benefit. It just needs to watch and count. Consider the economics from Beijing's perspective. A single DF-26 missile is estimated to cost somewhere between $15 and $20 million. A U.S. aircraft carrier costs $13 billion. The escort destroyers, the carrier air wing, the trained pilots, the decades of institutional knowledge sailing on that one ship represent an irreplaceable concentration of military power. One successful hit from a DF-26 doesn't just damage a hull. It potentially removes an entire carrier strike group from the fight and rewrites the strategic calculus of an entire theater. That's the kind of exchange ratio that keeps war planners staring at the ceiling, and there's no indication that China is slowing down production of these weapons. If anything, the September 2025 parade and the new DF-26D variant suggest they're accelerating. When Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28, 2026, there were two U.S. carrier strike groups in the Middle East, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford. By early March, a third carrier, the USS George H.W. Bush, was reportedly being deployed to the region as well. That's an unprecedented concentration of American naval power in a single theater. Operating a carrier strike group costs approximately $6.5 million per day, according to the Center for a New American Security. That covers fuel, personnel, supplies, maintenance, depreciation, and the logistical tail that keeps these floating cities operational. With two groups on station, that's $13 million every single day before a single missile is fired. If you add the third carrier, the daily burn climbs even higher. But the cost in dollars isn't even the real problem. The real problem is opportunity cost. During the peak of the 2025 Middle East crisis, two deployed carrier groups absorbed 41% of all U.S. Navy global carrier steaming days. 41% of America's available naval presence consumed in one theater, the wrong theater. Every carrier steaming day spent in the Arabian Sea is a carrier steaming day not available for freedom of navigation operations near the Taiwan Strait. Every destroyer positioned in the Red Sea is a destroyer not screening against Chinese submarines in the Philippine Sea. Every F-35 sortie flown over Iranian territory is maintenance hours and airframe life that won't be available if something happens in the Western Pacific tomorrow. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies warned that if the U.S. continued using interceptors during the 2026 Iran war at the same rate it did during the 12-day war, half of the entire American interceptor stockpile would be gone in 4 to 5 weeks. Half, in a month. And once those weapons are spent, they can't be replaced on any timeline that matters for a Pacific contingency. The strategic theorist John Mearsheimer, who has spent decades mapping the logic of great power competition, has argued that there is only one country capable of truly challenging American power, and that is China. He has further suggested that remaining deeply entangled in the Middle East, while ignoring China's rise, may represent one of the worst strategic blunders any great power has made in modern history. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, the math is hard to argue with. And what makes all of this so operationally precise from Beijing's perspective is that China doesn't need to do anything provocative. It doesn't need to threaten. It doesn't need to posture. It just needs to build, produce, and wait while the United States empties its own magazines on the other side of the world. There's another dimension to this that rarely gets discussed. America's allies are watching too. Japan ordered 400 Tomahawks to equip its destroyers with land attack capability. Those deliveries are now almost certainly going to face delays as U.S. production struggles to keep pace with its own wartime consumption. Australia, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands are all Tomahawk customers. Every missile fired over Iran pushes their orders further down the queue. The message being sent to every U.S. ally in the Pacific is unmistakable, even if unintentional. When it comes to American weapons, the Middle East eats first. And if something happens near Taiwan or the South China Sea, you might be waiting a very long time for resupply. Lockheed Martin signed a framework agreement in January 2026 to quadruple THAAD interceptor production from 96 to 400 per year. That sounds great until you read the fine print. The ramp-up is planned to take 7 years. During Lockheed's earnings call, CEO Jim Teichlet acknowledged the deal still needs Congress to approve fiscal 2026 funding before a final contract is even definitized. And even at 400 per year, if a conflict with China consumed interceptors at the rate they were burned in the 12-day war, 400 annual THAAD rounds would last roughly a month. On the Patriot side, Lockheed delivered just over 600 PAC-3 MSE interceptors in 2025, with plans to triple that to around 2,000 per year. Again, the timeline is 7 years. And defense analysts noted that roughly 600 PAC-3s is approximately what was fired in the first 2 days of the Iran war by all parties. 2 days of combat, 1 year of production. The Tomahawk picture is similarly grim. Raytheon has announced long-term ambitions to reach over 1,000 Tomahawks per year. But the current production rate is around 90 to 100, and each missile takes approximately 2 years to manufacture from start to delivery. Specialized electronics, solid rocket motors, and guidance systems all come from narrow supply chains that can't be scaled up by executive order. The Pentagon may need to seek as much as $50 billion in supplemental funding just to begin rebuilding what's already been spent. And underneath all of these production challenges lies a deeper structural problem. The United States doesn't just have a missile shortage, it has an industrial base shortage. The defense sector has been optimized for decades around small batch, high precision, extraordinarily expensive weapon systems. It was never designed for the kind of high-volume, rapid replacement production that modern saturation warfare demands. The entire architecture was built on the assumption that America would fight short, decisive wars against technologically inferior opponents where a small number of perfect weapons would be sufficient. That assumption just collided with reality over Iran, and the collision is going to echo for years. Meanwhile, China's defense industrial base operates on an entirely different model. Mass production, rapid iteration, dual-use factories that can pivot between commercial and military output. A workforce pipeline fed by the largest engineering education system on the planet. While the United States is trying to figure out how to produce 400 THAAD interceptors a year 7 years from now, China is already fielding hundreds of carrier-killer missiles and building warships at a rate that makes the U.S. look like it's standing still. There are people inside the Pentagon who see the problem clearly. The push toward low-cost interceptor concepts like the Cyclops program is an acknowledgement that you can't keep shooting $15 million missiles at $100,000 targets and call it a strategy. But these next-generation systems are still in development. They're years away from fielding in meaningful numbers. And in the meantime, every day of combat over Iran is burning through inventory that was supposed to last through the next decade. The financial dimension compounds everything. President Trump has publicly claimed that American munition stockpiles have never been higher. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has insisted arsenals are fully prepared, but the actual budget numbers tell a different story. The Pentagon had requested just 57 Tomahawks for fiscal year 2026. 57. That wouldn't even replace what was fired in a single afternoon of Operation Epic Fury. The gap between the rhetoric and the arithmetic has never been wider. Defending a $30,000 drone with a $3.7 million interceptor is not a victory, it's a transaction. And the ledger on that transaction, run to its conclusion, produces a military that has spent its precision strike inventory into depletion, whose factories cannot rebuild it in time, and whose naval forces are committed to the wrong ocean. The THAAD production shortfall won't meaningfully close for years, even under the new agreements. Tomahawk production, even with Raytheon's expanded framework, cannot undo what has already been spent. The Patriot stockpile sits at a fraction of what America's own military plans require for global contingencies. Iran understands this. Iran has understood it for years. The strategy was never to win a conventional war against the United States. It was to impose costs at asymmetric ratios until the defender's magazine was empty and the defender's industrial base was exposed. Not military defeat, industrial exhaustion, and now overlay that picture onto the Pacific. China's navy exceeding 400 planned warships against America's 296. Type 055 destroyers multiplying at rates the U.S. can't match. 250 or more DF-26 carrier-killer missiles pointed at the vessels that carry American power across the Pacific. A shipbuilding industry 232 times the size of America's own. New hypersonic weapons unveiled every year that are specifically designed to overwhelm the exact defensive systems America is currently burning through in the Middle East. The West built a defense architecture of breathtaking precision and breathtaking expense. Systems so sophisticated that stopping a $250,000 ballistic missile requires a $15 million response. An architecture that takes years to rebuild after days of depletion, a glass jaw that looks impenetrable until the magazine runs low. And somewhere in the silence behind all the headlines about interception rates and operational successes and diplomatic summits, the real transaction of this era is being completed. Not in the deserts of the Middle East, not in the mountains of Iran, in the shipyards of Shanghai, in the missile assembly lines of inland China, in the satellite imagery showing hundreds of carrier-killer launchers arrayed across the Chinese mainland. History doesn't announce when the pivot point arrives. It reveals it afterward, in retrospect, when analysts write about the decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, the deployments that seemed necessary, the interceptions that seemed successful, and trace the line from those decisions to the moment when the balance of power shifted quietly and permanently. I'm not drawing that line for you today. I'm showing you the numbers that let you draw it yourself. The production rates are in the budget documents, the shipbuilding figures are in the trade reports, the cost ratios are in the procurement records. Everything I've told you is publicly available information that anyone can verify. The question isn't whether this is happening. The question is whether anyone in a position to do something about it is looking at the same numbers and asking the question those numbers demand. Because the generals are reporting victories, the politicians are reporting strength, and the accountants, the ones who understand what it means to fire 150 THAAD missiles in 12 days when you produce 96 a year, are staring at their spreadsheets in silence. 3 days of combat in the Middle East consumed 5 years of American cruise missile production. The interceptor stockpile could be halved in a matter of weeks at current rates. And the country that benefits most from every dollar spent and every missile fired over Iran is 9,000 miles away, building warships, counting days, and not making a sound. That silence is the most important thing in the room right now, and almost nobody is listening to it.